very quote unquote male centric. The decisions were not as people focused as they could be. And a lot of times I just tried to shield Meetup from it. But when I announced that Meetup was being divested out of WeWork, I remember a woman in the back jumped up and screamed, "Hallelujah!" She was so happy that we actually divested from WeWork. So it was very hard to handle and manage having a corporate parent that was in the news as often as it was and was so negatively thought of as often as it was. Even though they're really just a corporate parent, they didn't really have anything to do with Meetup. But they were still, we still got our paychecks that said WeWork on them. So there's still obviously that connection. And then other times in my life, I remember I was an executive at a company called Everyday Health, which is similar to WebMD, about, whatever it was, 15 years ago or so. And I was running an organization. We had about 150 people on the team. And I was surprised and I was told we're going public. Great. It was in investment mode. And they said, you need to cut half your people. So I put a list together of half the people that we had to cut. And I put my name on that list. And I said, listen, I don't want to run this organization and kind of, we're not set up to succeed. And then we both agreed. And then I was let go and I got severance, and that worked out fine. And they treated me extremely generously from a severance perspective as well. And then there was one other time, Investopedia, actually, I should add this story too. I was running the company. It was a real success story. We over tripled the company's revenue in about 4 years. And I reported into a larger company called IAC, which owns Match and Tinder and Home Advisor and Angie's List and a lot of other interesting companies. And one day the CEO walked into my office and said, "We sold our company and you're no longer going to be the CEO of Investopedia anymore." And that was quite the shock.
That's a nice way to find out.
Quite the shock. And it's like, "Well, we love you. So, we'll have you be like some made up job until we figure out what to do with you." So then again, I got fired, quote unquote. But it was just a very good learning of I don't want to surprise other people the way I was just surprised.
So we've talked about how you operate within the business that Meetup ultimately is, but let's talk about what you do for your users and the philosophy behind it. For those who don't know Meetup, I wonder if you could just go back a bit in time and tell us the story of how Meetup came into being.
Oh, I would love to do that. Okay. So most people don't know this, but it's quite extraordinary. If not for 9/11, September 11th, 2001, the day that the Twin Towers were the terrorist act that happened, Meetup wouldn't exist. So our founder, Scott Heiferman, who is just an exceptional individual, is living in New York City, and he was in the lobby of his apartment building. And, he saw the Twin Towers literally fall down and get destroyed in total state of shock, just like we were all in a state of shock at that time. And he wanted to be by himself. So he went to his lobby, and he knows a lot of other people just didn't want to be by themselves either, because such a time of tragedy and just so painful. And he walked over to someone, "Oh, what floor do you live on?" And the person said he lives on the 5th floor. And Scott actually lived on the same floor. And he realized he didn't even know the person, even though he'd been living on the floor for actually multiple years. And then he realized, and thinking about it, and he said, it shouldn't take tragedy to build community. How do we build an app? Well, it wasn't an app at that point. How do we build a website, meetup.com? It became more of an app and a website. It's both now. To build community for people so that people could connect. So we could, 46% of people regularly feel lonely. How do we end the loneliness epidemic that kind of exists in this world? So he went back to his apartment and he sketched out the concept of Meetup. And then the site was launched 21 years ago. 21 years ago in June of 2002. And it's really remarkable. We have, as you mentioned earlier, 62 million members now. We have 100,000 events every week. We have 260,000 different communities, and it's everything from hiking groups to book clubs to lesbian photographers of Brooklyn. So it could be niche, it could be broad, it could be anything, and knitting groups, you name it. And And it's really, I consider myself like the luckiest person to be able to be part of a company that deeply builds connections for people. And I wear my Meetup t-shirt around like everywhere I go. I was just in Kentucky in the United States a couple of days ago, believe it or not. And a person walked over to me, seeing my Meetup t-shirt, said, "You work at Meetup?" And he said, "Yeah." And then he said, "I'm from Toronto and I use Meetup all the time. Met my girlfriend through me." It's just, this happens constantly. And it's just such a good feeling.
That is wonderful. And how did it come to spread so fast and so widely?
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the very, very smart, there's two things that happened. One is that Scott was able to get some major actual politicians to advocate for Meetup very early. So there was a person running for the president of the United States named Howard Dean, and he created hundreds of Meetup groups and talked about Meetup at every campaign stop he did. And the big increase happened when a little known senator, a person who was running for the Senate in the state of Illinois in the United States, and his name is Barack Obama. And he actually went around the country, excuse me, the state, telling everyone that if there was over, I think it was 500 people that joined a Meetup group and had an event, he would show up anywhere in the state and talk. And then people just heard it, went wildfire. In fact, he was just about a year ago, he wrote a book and he was going on all the talk shows talking about how Meetup helped to, drive his growth. So that was great. So on the one hand, you have like celebrity influence, which really helps. It's a very viral type product because what happens is over 80-90% of our people who become Meetup organizers and want to organize a Meetup group are very active members. So what happens is you join a group, you become an active member of the group, then you might become an organizer of a different group, and then you invite people that you know to become members of your group, and then Meetup also helps to drive more members in the group. Then suddenly those active members then become organized well, and it's this positive kind of viral loop that happens in the business to help to catapult its growth.
And so Meetup has an extraordinary political potential, doesn't it? I mean, I'm really interested in this because in my other life, I run an organization called Compassion in Politics, which is looking at how to put compassion into the political space. But there's a huge opportunity here for politicians to use your groups as a way of campaigning and gathering support.
Yeah, more so than Twitter, I believe. Listen, the way that Meetup is used by so many people is to build community and to build passionate followings around anything. If you're an author, then you might want to build a compassionate following around a concept in your book. If you're a politician, you want to build compassionate followers around your political ideology. If you're a yoga instructor, then you want to build compassionate followers around people who will join your yoga studio, right? So I think it's relevant across any dimension where people want to build, kind of have influence both in person and online, and conduct events to build one's brand.
And how do you balance that amazing potential against the need to depolarize, the need to bring together different communities? Yeah. What role can Meetup play in that really vital function?
Super important. So two things is, one, we invest tens of millions of dollars through the years, and over $1 million each year in technology and people in our trust and safety team. So for example, when at the time of the insurrection, July 6th, I think it was July 6th, excuse me, January 6th, that happened in the United States. There were many groups that wanted to start at Meetup to kind of support that situation, and we didn't allow those groups to be built. So every single group that gets created goes through human intervention to check. We get complaints all the time. We've turned away millions of dollars in revenue for groups that we thought were not appropriate for different types of content, political, sexual, other type of content that's not appropriate. So that's one kind of answer to it. The second is a big part of what we do at Meetup is we ask people and really build the culture of having people show up as their authentic selves. And well, the beauty of that is that people don't feel judged. Like a friend of mine that I know, he's 50 years old. He goes to a horror film meetup group where they all go to horror movies together and have dinner together. It's beautiful. He's like, there are people in their 20s and the people in their 70s and 80s, and they all hang out together. And he's like, there are people that were so ageist before. 80-year-olds thought, oh, those millennials, they know nothing. And then, the 20-year-olds were like, oh, seniors, they know nothing. And like, they're all hanging out, they're all having a great time together. And then when people can meet people who have different backgrounds than them, people, whether it's gender, age, race, ethnicity, religion, etc., then ignorance declines and relationships are built. And that's how I think things like xenophobia, can end. And it's such an important thing.
You talked about people showing up as their real selves, and we know as humans that can be a really tough thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
We can be shy, we can be scared, we can be hurt, we can be wounded, we might be so alienated from ourselves that we don't know who that real self is. How do you facilitate or encourage or support people to show up in their real selves?
Yeah. So we do two things. One main one is there's lots of different groups for people who may be a little bit different. For example, we have many like introvert groups where someone says, I want to handle being it's a group for introverts. And if you hear you're joining a group for introverts and you happen to be introverted, you feel a lot more comfortable being introverted. And maybe in the beginning, you don't put your camera on because that's a little bit too stressful for you. Or maybe in the beginning, you only do chat and you don't get called on. So I think if there's that, we have many different like LGBTQ support groups so people can share experiences with each other about what they happen to have gone through, during that time, or things that they're thinking about or struggling with or proud of. And that's kind of an important thing. So we have so many different groups for people to feel comfortable being their authentic selves that, is very much part of the ethos. And it's really just embraced throughout the organization.
And one of the other inhibitors, in terms of compassion, fear is a big inhibitor to compassion. And I know you've written about your own shyness, which I really relate to. I was almost mute as a child. I was so terrified.
Wow,
And
I would never have thought it.
well, ditto you.
Yeah.
And so, we're lucky, we found a way of being in the world. But for people who are shy and just socially phobic, how do they use Meetup?
Yeah, it's really hard. I'll tell you a very brief story because I think it's a really beautiful story related to, and then I'll talk a little more detail about stories are always nice. So there's a exceptional individual. His name is Anthony Acosta, and he lives in Fort Worth, Texas. And he became kind of obsessed because of his shyness with video games. And he would just spend first an hour, then 2 hours, and 5 hours, 10 hours, just playing video games just all the time. And just really became a recluse to a large extent. And his parents became so worried about him. His brother became worried about him. Brother lived hours away, but he drove to his home and was like, you need to go to a meetup group. You need to start. You used to enjoy rock climbing. You used to enjoy doing other things. Just find one thing that you feel you're passionate about, even though you don't have to talk at it, right? You enjoy bowling, just go bowling. Enjoy, you could find something that you're more comfortable in not having a conversation. So we went to a rock climbing group. He started rock climbing. He had a great time. He went back, second time, went back a third time. Each month he would go back. The head of the group ended up moving to a new city. Head of the group said, hey, you've been here the last 3 or 4 times. I want you to take over the group. And he's like, what? Take over the group? Come, me? I could never do. I've never led anything in my life. And he ended up taking over the group. This is about 10 years ago. He's had over 900 events and 6 marriages. It's not even a singles group. Have come from the group that he's gone to 6 weddings that people have met in the group. So, and it's not a singles thing. It just happens to be there were many people who are single that went to this particular rock climbing group. So the reason I give that as an example is he did a bunch of things that I would suggest to answer your question, which is firstly, he showed up. And that's the first step. Because if you don't show up, you really there's nothing, you can't do anything. You have to show up. You could show up and sit on the side. You could show up later and leave early. He showed up, and then he showed up a second time. And every time that he showed up, he felt a little more comfortable. His brother went with him, so he had that security blanket in the beginning, and he brought someone with him, which is what I would say for individuals who are shy. It's sometimes easier to bring someone with you to an event, but then to say, okay, we're going to be at the event together, but let's spend a little time not just together, let's spend a time separate. And that gets people to just do it. There's many stories that I've heard of people who are so shy, they will come to a meetup event, they'll sit in their car, they'll see people walking into the event, and they won't leave their car. They'll just turn around and go home. And I know someone that did that numerous times and finally got the courage to just get out of her car, walk into the event, and met a whole bunch of people that she's very close with today because of it. So it's just, step one is just finding a way to just show up, and good things happen from there.
And to show up and then be met with warmth and compassion and consideration, how do you ensure that that is how people are met when they enter a group?
Yeah. When you show up, one of the things that we do is we ask our organizers, and we really train them on how to create a welcoming environment for people who show up to their groups. It's so important. And the best thing you could do as an organizer, as a member, if you see someone in the corner by themselves, walk over to them. If you see someone, a new face, walk over to them. And if everyone takes on collective responsibility when they see a new face, good things can ultimately happen. And now what happens is that people who were new faces, and have people walk over to them, they want to pay it forward, and they want to share that compassion with others. And that creates a culture within these groups of caring, which is so important to helping people feel welcome.
And this, of course, is a culture that we need to see beyond Meetup.
Globally, yes.
To see it everywhere. And that's part of the reason why the Global Coalition for Compassion exists. And one of the things I love about your work is it's about connection. And, unless there is connection, we can't have compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And you spoke about, as the American Surgeon General has spoken about very recently, about
Yes.
the epidemic of loneliness and the impact that it has on our physical well-being.
Yeah,
I mean, I know
insane.
there are some really surprising statistics. Maybe you'd like to share some of them.
Yeah,
about
I'll share a couple.
how bad loneliness is for us physically.
It's really crazy. It's really crazy, Jennifer. I mean, it's insane that loneliness is more dangerous to your physical health than smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. I know in the UK, but in many countries outside the US, in the US to some extent, in the UK, it's very impressive, the kind of commercials that are shared around encouraging people, not to smoke, and the physical dangers of smoking for many people. Yet, it's better to smoke 2 packs a day for your physical health than to be lonely, because the stress that happens when people are lonely, the anxiety that people have because they can't communicate and share it with others, God forbid, a million times, depression or self-harm even that can happen around loneliness. It's so detrimental to individuals that it's literally worse than that. The other statistic that's just scary is that only 25% of people have a trusted confidant that they could go to in a time of need. And that's just like, kind of terrifying that, that 25% of people don't have a trusted confidant. That's a lot of people in the world that don't have someone they could go to. So there's a lot. It's a long 82-page study. I actually just wrote an article about it and shared it on LinkedIn. If anyone here wants to link in with me, just about some of the results of the study, but it's quite eye-opening.
It is, and at the Global Compassion Coalition, we have set up a connectors group for exactly that reason. And what we're trying to do is encourage people in their everyday lives to really own the power that comes with connection. And we've got quite a lot of signups already, so hopefully some of them will be finding their way into your Meetup groups and really using compassion to try and help create those connections that can, attack this epidemic of loneliness. And I just wondered if you could share.
Thanks for sharing the article, by the way.
Oh, great. Thank you.
It was just shared.
Yeah, the article is in the chat. That's done by Claggy, who is invisible to all of you watching, but is here and helped organize this conversation and set it up. There's Claggy. Hi, Claggy. Thank you so much for all you're doing behind the scenes to make this conversation happen. In a moment, we're going to go to questions, so please do post any questions in the chat. Before we do that, I just wondered what your analysis was of how we've ended up with so much loneliness in our world. You talked about your youth and the level of connection you had as a child. How have we got to this position where a quarter of adults don't have a close confidant?
Yeah, I think there's two factors that have been the greatest contributors to it. One is really the destruction in many ways of institutions that drive community. So religion is not for everyone. And I'm not saying it should be by any means, but when there's high participations in mosques and churches and synagogues and temples, that will help to drive community for people. And that infrastructure has been massively weakened over the last 50, 100 plus years. And people don't necessarily go to church each week and see each other, etc. There's a famous study that was done by Robert Putnam many years ago. He wrote a book called Bowling Alone, which has shown that more people are bowling, fewer people are part of bowling leagues, more people are bowling alone. And all these different, again, infrastructures, like my grandparents were in a bowling league every Thursday and they would bowl together and they bowled other people. I was even in a bowling league as a kid, a mother's son bowling league, actually. And where there's parent-teacher associations, block party associations, other types of infrastructure that exist. If you look at almost every single metric of those types of institutions, they're down, 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 and down. So that's one big factor. And of course, like what everyone loves to blame for everything, which is usually true, is of course social media, which is people have they're replacing community, unfortunately, not with no community, but with false community. So sometimes replacing something with actually something that's false is far worse than not replacing it all, because people think that they have community. So for example, if you're replacing a real community that you would have had in a club in school, let's say, of getting together in person and playing lacrosse or cricket or anything else together, and you're replacing that with your fake community, which is your Instagram community, your Snapchat community, TikTok community, then and your relationship is one where you're quote unquote liking people and you have connections with people that are purely virtual only, people think that solves things, and oftentimes it just makes people lonelier and feel worse about themselves. So there's obviously positive technology. At Meetup, we actually say we use technology to get people off of technology, because we need to use technology. But I would say those are the two factors. And I think finding how to create boundaries around technology is important. Doesn't mean not to use it. I love my phone. I love and I hate it. Very, very valuable for lots of things. And trying to force oneself to just get together in person. There's wonderful virtual events, and this webinar is a great example of a virtual experience that hopefully is helpful for everyone. But there's nothing that replaces like in-person connecting, as well, which I think is very important.
It's so true. And one of the other issues that so needs tackling in our world is what happens when we're geographically separate. It's easy to care about those we're proximate to. It's easy to care about our friends, our family, our work colleagues. And yet we look across the world, and for the price of a cup of coffee, we could get someone a mosquito net, and yet we don't. How do you think we can try and bridge that gap in whom we empathize with and the action we take?
Yeah, I think it so much comes down to exposure, that if I were to end up meeting someone who is from an African village for whatever reason, not easy, but if I did, my entire and understood more about their life, my entire perspective on what they went through would be completely different. So how do we help people to get out of their comfort zone, How do we help people to meet people who are different from each other, who are different socioeconomic backgrounds from each other, who could not just be like in the quote unquote country club, in the British country club or Australian country club, the golf club, and in the fancy places in the United States. But instead, how do we get people to meet people who are very different from each other? That's a big part of Meetup. And it's a big part of a lot of organizations out there, Compassion Coalition, et cetera. And I think that's the solve. It's building relations with people who are different. And then that helps people to get exposure and hopefully to donate to those causes that are important.
Thank you. So let's take a few of these questions. So from Olivia, how do you think about the intersection of equity and compassion in your various roles?
Yeah, what I would say is fundamental. It's fundamental. If you're leading an organization and you're not prioritizing both diversity and equity in your approach to leading a team, then well, you're not going to be successful. It's just that straight up. The equity doesn't mean every single person makes the same salary. That's not what equity means. Equity means that every person is paid appropriately for their roles, and equity means that every person is treated in the same way, regardless of their background, their history, their skin, their religion, ethnicity, etc. It's extremely important to lead an organization that prioritizes equity. And without it, you're never going to get the best people, and you're never going to make the right decision. You're not going to make decisions based on understanding, because, for example, for Meetup, our constituency is everyone. And if our employee base is not representative of that same constituency, then we have a problem. It can't succeed. So I would say that's fundamentally important. And one of the things I'm actually most proud of is that for many years, a majority of Meetup executives are either non-binary or female, and that's a really important ethos that we have within our company of really trying to prioritize growth, and so that the company is not just kind of white male dominant, because that's just not the way to succeed as a company, frankly. It's just not a smart business proposition.
Wonderful. And a question from Joe. I was just wondering about measuring loneliness in local communities to identify needs unique to that community. How can you talk a bit about that?
I love that idea. It would be really cool. So, for example, Joe, we actually issued a report at Meetup. I don't know how you'd find it. I think you just type in Meetup Friendship Report. Maybe someone could help to share it if they could find it. It's called the Meetup Friendship Report. We issued a few months ago, and it actually looked at different cities and the state of connections, the state of friendship in different cities. It found actually the friendliest city in the world, at least from Meetup's perspective, was Dublin, Ireland, which is kind of interesting. A lot of friendly people there. Friendliest city in the United States, coincidentally, interestingly, was Atlanta, Georgia. And it's based on a whole bunch of different factors that our data science and machine learning teams kind of look at to factor in kind of how big is the population size, how many Meetup events happen, what's the number of connections between the people that when events happen, how many people RSVP to those events, et cetera. But you can look at that and you can find which cities tend to be kind of the friendliest, and the opposite of that is, of course, which cities tend to be, the most lonely. And I'll tell you something, what always strikes me is that the biggest cities in the world are oftentimes the most lonely. Because people could feel even more lonely when they're in a big city than when they happen to be in a town with a small number of people where everyone's looking out for each other.
So it's the anonymity of a city, you think,
Correct.
That alone in a crowd.
Yep.
In a busy crowd.
Exactly. Well said.
And just finally, this has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
What's your vision? What's your, you've got a company that is doing extraordinary things to improve the levels of connection and to address loneliness. What's your vision going forward? Ultimately, what would you like to see Meetup contribute to?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I feel like we failed, that we only have 60 million people when we should have 6 billion people. There are some organizations that, let's say, the number of people that could use their product are 100 people, 1,000 people, 1 million people, 10 million people. You get 10 million people, it's like, wow, amazing. But there are 6 to 7 billion people in this world that can and should be finding ways of building community and finding connections and finding friends, and finding people to share their passions. And we're less than 100th of where we potentially could be. So, it's nothing major except for, how do we encourage as many people, and this is a part of this conversation today, to step up and say, hey, I want to step up and be part of, the Compassion Coalition. I want to step up and create a meetup group because of this one thing I'm passionate about. I'm passionate about photography. I'm passionate about sports, history, language, love speaking Swahili, whatever language it is. And then the world will be a better place. We actually did a study, University of Pennsylvania did a study not many years ago, about 4 or 5 years ago, and found that on happiness, and found the more meetup events that people went to, the happier that they were. Pretty remarkable. So there's really a direct correlation there.
Okay, so that's a fantastic incentive to get to a meetup group. And also I hope to sign up to our Compassion Connectors program, and we'll try and get our connectors joining up with your groups and seeing what we can do to spread it even further. I'm just noticing one last question from Tanya. Would you say churches should be used as a hub to bring communities together? Pros and cons of using churches?
Yeah, I mean, listen, you don't want people to feel marginalized, right? And I think, it would depend on where, but I would say on a personal level, this is just an N of one. I'm someone who's Jewish. I would feel very comfortable walking into a church for an event. If the event was about Christianity, I may feel personally less comfortable about it. But I think using the venue of a church is, in my mind, no different than using the venue of a library, a Starbucks, any kind of other venue where people want to meet and connect. If the event is about learning about the Bible and Christianity, then that's great too. That's wonderful, as long as it's just advertised as such, and that's wonderful. And I think the more events that are around people learning about things that they're passionate about, the better. So absolutely, I think a church can be a great venue for things not related to religion and/or things related to religion.
Great, thank you. Sorry, I know I said we were winding up, but I just have to ask these last 2 questions.
Great.
Because it's so great that people are posting so
Yeah,
many.
I love it.
Everyone who's watching it. So this is, I'm not sure who this is from, but what's a surprising problem you've had to solve at Meetup while trying to help people meet others?
Sure. I think the biggest problem that we face is when people have a first event as an organizer, and let's say only 2 or 3 or 4 people show up, and they expected there to be immediately 30 people, and it's managing expectations. Almost every organizer I speak to that has had tremendous success, thousands of people in their groups, their first event, they only have a few people. And the second event, they have 7 or 8 people. And third event, they have 10 or 12 people. Fourth event, there are 20 people. So it's understanding that building a community takes time, and you don't have a community day one, but you have a community is only 3 people. 3 people counts as a community, you and 2 others. You start off with that, and it will grow, and helping people understand that it could start small and grow very, very big if that's one's goal.
And then a question from Jim: how is Meetup different from other platforms like Facebook, for example?
So the 2 biggest platforms that are a bit different are Facebook and Eventbrite. Eventbrite is really about the event and how people go to events. It's not about the group and the community. Meetup is all about the group and community having events. Facebook is really much more about a digital relationship with people. People join a Facebook group, they interact with each other digitally. It's not necessarily an in-person. There are some, and many in fact, Facebook in-person events, but when I've talked to organizers, they'll say, well, I have a Facebook group and a Meetup group, and I have people interacting digitally in my Facebook group, but in my Meetup group is when I have people actually showing up. And when it's a Meetup group, the expectation is that people will actually show up. So it's just a different mindset that people have to get people to do things in person.
And how do you balance that kind of your clear social mission and purpose against the need to make a profitable company?
Yeah,
How,
I mean,
how
it's a struggle, but one of the things that we say is that revenue gives oxygen to our mission, meaning the more people that use Meetup, the more revenue we end up getting, whether it's advertising revenue, whether it's people creating groups and becoming organizer revenue. We have members who can pay to a subscription fee for extra privileges to be able to kind of friend and connect with others. So, the more influence and impact that we have, the more revenue that we're going to have. And we're not worried about how that happens. We have the mechanism in place to make it happen.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. It's
Sure.
a really inspiring thing that you do, and one that our world really needs.
Thank you so much. This was so delightful. Thank you for actually reading the book that I had, Decide and Conquer. And it sounds like you shared, you read some of it in terms of my background. And this was just delightful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks everyone at home for joining us.